Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you for watching. In this video, I'd like to talk about the philosophy of Mencius. He's also referred to as Mencius, but I'll refer to him in what follows as Mencius. And Mencius, as many of you probably know, is a Confucian philosopher. So he follows in the footsteps of Confucius. He was born and lived a couple hundred years after Confucius. Confucius was around in the 6th century before the current era, and Mencius was living in the 4th century and into the 3rd century before the current era. His dates, if you're curious, are 372 to 289 before the current era. And if you don't know much about Confucianism, or if you don't know much about Confucius, you can watch my video lectures on Confucius. In order to make this video make sense for those of you who don't know much about Confucianism, let me say a few words about Confucius, and then I'll turn to the philosophy of Mencius. So what I'd like to do moving forward is first set the stage by talking about some of the key themes from Confucius's philosophy, and then talk about a few things from Mencius's philosophy, and we'll see where there's a broad similarity, but we'll also note a couple important differences moving forward. So that's what's going to happen in this part of this discussion of Mencius. So Confucius. Who's Confucius? Well, we know 6th century philosopher, was living during the times of the Chu dynasty, and a couple things characterize the Chu dynasty during the life of Confucius. One, it's a state where there's lots of warfare. Feudal lords are battling it out with one another for power, and so then two, there's lots of social anarchy, which leads to social unrest. So Confucius was one of several thinkers or groups of thinkers who came up with solutions to the anarchic problems plaguing the Chu dynasty. Confucius, he developed a philosophy that was to some significant degree based on his thinking about the context in which he was living and trying to offer a solution there too. So Confucius, he developed a view that's sometimes considered revivalist, meaning that he takes ideas from the past and makes them current for the sake of transforming the society that he was living in. Now, he didn't meet success in his lifetime with respect to spreading his ideas, but his theory is revivalistic. So had he gained the ear of a ruler who had significant influence, that he could have influenced, that or had Confucius been able to influence, then we would have seen a kind of revivalism potentially occurring in Confucius's time. Okay, that didn't happen, but that didn't stop Confucius from developing his revivalist theory and attempting to employ it. He tried to get the ear of many a ruler, but he met with little to no success in his life at this. And he actually died feeling a failure because he wasn't able to advise a ruler properly in the ways that he thought that he should be advised. So there's a kind of revivalism. Confucius thinks that there are ideas during the golden era of the Chu dynasty that need to be appealed to help transform the society, the culture in which he was living. Then there's also the idea of virtue that's prevalent in Confucius's thinking. And this is related to his revivalism in the following way. Confucius thought that in the golden era of the Chu dynasty, there were virtuous rulers. And the virtuous rulers were such that they were able to positively influence their subjects, their citizens. And he kind of holds, Confucius does, a trickle-down theory of virtue. If you have virtuous rulers, then you'll end up with a virtuous citizenry. And there are passages in Confucius that capture this. So in his Analects, there's a famous passage where he says this, if you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves. And then a local ruler comes to him concerned about the prevalence of robbers in lieu, and Confucius says in response, if you could just rid yourself of your own excessive desires, the people would not steal even if you rewarded them for it. So he seems to think that virtue is going to be a key to resolving the ills of the anarchic state in which he found himself living. And so we see that there's a revivalism, but there's also an important discussion of virtue. So virtue is significant to Confucius' philosophy. The key virtue is Ren. Ren is oftentimes translated as human-heartedness, human goodness, and Confucius thinks that first and foremost this virtue needs to be cultivated. It needs to be instilled in the virtuous ruler, and the virtuous ruler will provide for the Ren and the human goodness that we're going to find in the citizenry. That's not to say that individuals don't also need to cultivate the virtues in themselves, independent of the ruler, but the ruler provides that sort of basis, that sort of model that we can look to for guidance on this score. So there's the virtue of Ren, and the key way of achieving Ren is captured in the passage I read a moment ago. It's the virtue of Li, according to Confucius. So there's an essential virtue, or a most essential virtue for achieving Ren, and that's following the rituals. It's living a life of propriety as he would have it. So we have this most essential virtue, Li, that is most essential in an instrumental sense for producing in us human goodness, human-heartedness, or Ren, according to Confucius. And there are other virtues that he develops as significant to his overall theory of the virtues, but I want to move on and talk about Mencius. So let what I've said about Confucius there suffice. There are many other facets of Confucius' philosophy, but let that suffice for now. Again, you can watch my other videos. And if you have any questions about Confucius, you can always comment below asking questions, and I'll gladly answer any to the best of my ability. Now, let's move on to Mencius. Mencius, as I've noted, was living in the 4th century, predominantly in his lifetime, before the current era. He followed Confucius in a myriad of ways, philosophically, but he also did so practically. Confucius in his lifetime went around trying to find rulers to talk to, find rulers to advise. He wanted to get their ear because he thought he had a solution to the anarchical state. And Mencius did the same thing. Mencius followed Confucius practically, not just philosophically, by trying to get the ear of rulers to advise them according to Confucian principles. Mencius is through and through Confucian, and he's trying to do the same thing Confucius was doing. He's going around trying to find rulers to advise properly. Now, there were other solutions out there that advisors, rulers would listen to, that the rulers would listen to as advisors, excuse me. There were the legalists who thought that the rulers needed to rule with iron fists, with force and power. And then there were those who thought that, no, we needed a more kind of benevolent love displayed by the rulers for the sake of bringing about and promoting happiness for all generally. It's a kind of utilitarian view based on benevolent rulers. Um, Confucianism takes a different tack. It takes the tack of cultivating the virtues, the virtue namely the common one that I've mentioned already, Ren. And so Mencius, he challenged both the legalists and the advisors who would promote a kind of benevolent utilitarianism. He also taught in the vein, as I mentioned, of Confucianism, but he did so in a very similar way that Confucius did. He thought that Ren was the source of all human goodness. It's the key virtue. It's the most important of the virtues. So he's going to follow that teaching from Confucius in his efforts to advise rulers. And one important break, though, between Mencius and Confucius is that Mencius thought that it wasn't Li that was the most important virtue that's supposed to be instrumental for bringing about Ren, but rather it's Yi. Yi is different in that it focuses on righteousness as opposed to practicing rituals. So what Mencius would say is that if you want people to become virtuous, no less than your rulers, of course, you want them to live righteous lives. You want them to be performing right actions regularly. You want the people to be exercising their wills to do the right thing at every juncture as best they possibly can. And that's the way that you cultivate human goodness. So it's Yi, human righteousness, that leads most essentially to Ren, not Li, ritualistic practices that Confucius would have endorsed. So that's a key difference. That's a key break. Now they both think that that the cultivation of the virtues begins in one's family. That's really the parent-child sibling relationship that serves as the foundation for the cultivation of our virtues. But then once it's established there, the cultivation of the virtues can extend outwardly to one's, say, town, one's city, one's state, one's country, and then ultimately to the universe. And so for both Confucius and Mencius, it begins, the cultivation of virtue, that is, begins in the family. So here we see a very significant connection on the virtue Ren between Confucius and Mencius, but we also see a key break. How is that we are essentially going to become such that we are humanly good or developing that virtue of Ren? Well, according to Confucius, it's Li. According to Mencius, it's Yi. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a sense of how it is that roughly Mencius follows Confucius in this very significant kind of way. Now, I want to allude to something to conclude this video lecture, and it has to do with the idea of human nature as it's developed in Mencius. And there's an important, you could say, difference between Mencius and Confucius on the theory of human nature. And it's pretty straightforward. For Confucius, he doesn't say much about human nature. He does think that we're born with the capacity to become virtuous, but he doesn't say that we are by our nature good, or that it's our propensity to be good, or anything like that. He's rather silent on that. But Mencius isn't. Mencius thinks that our human nature is disposed to be good. It's not as if we are born with a good human nature. No, we need to cultivate the virtues. But we are born with an inclination or propensity toward becoming good. And that serves as the basis of his theory of human nature. So with him, we actually have some more concrete content for what human nature looks like. It has the potential, even stronger, a propensity toward becoming good. So that concludes this video lecture, this video on Mencius. Let this be part 1, In the next video, I'm going to say a bit more about it. Thank you for watching.